History remembers Genghis Khan as a conqueror, but conquest was not where his life began. He began as Temujin, a boy abandoned by allies, hunted by enemies, and raised in a world where survival depended less on birth than on loyalty. The cold paradox is that the man who united vast lands first learned what it meant to have almost nothing. What did exile teach him that settled kings never understood? And how did Genghis Khan, an outcast, conquer the known world? Long before Temujin became Genghis Khan, before armies carried his name across Asia, his world was an open land with no boundaries. The Mongolian steppe of the late 12th century stretched beneath a sky that seemed larger than the earth. Grasslands rolled toward hills, broken by rivers, rocky ridges, forest margins, and dry country where pasture could thin. There were few walls to hold people in place, but this did not mean the land was empty or free. Every valley, stream, winter camp, and grazing route could matter to families whose animals depended on grass and water. A place that looked limitless from a distance could become narrow when several communities needed the same pasture together. Life here followed movement rather than streets. Camps shifted with the seasons because herds could not remain on one patch of ground. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and other livestock turned grass into food, clothing, fuel, transport, and security. A household survival rested on animals that had to be protected from hunger, disease, theft, and severe weather. The people of the steppe therefore learned to read small changes in the landscape. The condition of the grass, the direction of the wind, the level of a river, and the first signs of winter were not abstractions. They shaped decisions about when to move, where to stop, and whom to approach or avoid. Mobility was not wandering without purpose. It was a disciplined response to an environment in which staying still could be more dangerous than leaving. Yet movement created uncertainty. Families carried their homes and possessions, but they could not carry pasture with them. They depended on knowledge shared across generations, on agreements with allies, and on the strength to defend access when agreements failed. This was the first world Temujin inherited, not a wilderness, but a human landscape organized through memory, animals, kinship, and movement. His beginnings cannot be separated from it. The child who would command distant cities first belonged to a society where power was measured partly by whether people would ride with you, camp near you, and help protect your herds when conditions turned against you. The steppe also joined regions that settled societies often imagined as far apart. Routes crossed the grasslands toward northern forests, western plains, Central Asian oases, and the states of northern China. Traders, envoys, captives, craftsmen, and warriors moved through these spaces. Goods made far away could enter a mobile camp, while horses and livestock from the steppe could travel outward. The people living there were not isolated from the wider world. They stood between several worlds, learning from contact while guarding their own ways of life. Still, contact did not produce lasting peace. Political authority was divided among many groups, and alliances could change when leaders died, marriages shifted, or stronger rivals appeared. A family might be secure during one season and exposed during another. Protection depended less on a fixed border than on relationships that had to be maintained. Without stone walls, people built other forms of shelter. Loyalty, reputation, marriage, obligation, and the expectation of mutual aid. These invisible boundaries could be stronger than timber, yet they could also disappear quickly. This helps explain the cold uncertainty surrounding Temujin's early life. He was not born into a world where a title automatically guaranteed safety. Status had meaning only while enough people recognized it. A respected father could gather followers, arrange alliances, and offer protection, but his death might loosen every bond around his household. The open landscape trained its people to move rapidly, endure distance, and depend on animals, but it also taught them that security was temporary. Temujin's later rise would grow from these conditions, though nothing in the land promised that he would survive them at all. Before he became a conqueror, he was one child beneath this enormous sky, held not by walls but by a fragile circle of human loyalty. For the families of the Mongolian steppe, movement was the basic method by which life remained possible. Herds needed fresh grass, animals needed water, and people needed shelter from winds that could change quickly across open country. A camp useful in summer might become exposed in winter, while a valley offering protection during cold months could not support animals through every season. Households therefore moved according to patterns shaped by experience. These movements were not identical everywhere, and no single route described all pastoral life. But the principle was widely shared. Survival depended on knowing when the land could provide and when it was time to leave. Animals stood at the center of this system. Sheep and goats supplied meat, milk, hides, wool, and other materials. Cattle and yaks could provide heavier strength and additional food. Camels were valuable in drier regions, while horses transformed distance itself. A mounted herder could watch scattered animals, carry messages, hunt, visit allies, or respond to danger faster than a person on foot. Children learned to ride early because the horse was not a luxury separated from daily life. It was part of work, travel, communication, and social belonging. The later speed of Mongol armies would grow from this older pastoral world, not from a sudden military invention. Long before Temujin commanded riders, generations had already learned how to care for horses, cross difficult ground, and organize life around motion. Their dwellings reflected the same logic. Felt-covered circular homes could be assembled, taken down, and transported with household goods. Felt helped reduce wind and preserve warmth, while the round form suited an exposed landscape. Inside, space was limited but ordered. Food, tools, bedding, containers, weapons, and personal possessions had to fit within a home designed to move. Dried animal dung could be used as fuel where wood was scarce. Milk could be processed into forms that lasted longer than fresh liquid. Meat could be preserved when conditions allowed. These practices were not signs of a simple life. They represented accumulated knowledge about how to turn a difficult environment into a place where families could endure. Yet dependence on animals created its own dangers. A severe winter, summer drought, livestock disease, or raid could damage a household more deeply than the loss of ordinary property in a settled town. Animals were food, transport, wealth, and the means of producing more animals. When herds declined, families could lose both present security and their ability to recover. This vulnerability helps explain why cooperation mattered so greatly. Relatives and allies could share pasture information, lend animals, protect a camp, or help a weakened household rebuild. Those without support faced a harsher path. Temujin's earliest world was therefore shaped by a quiet tension between independence and dependence. A family carried its own home and moved under its own judgment, yet no family was truly self-sufficient. Herds could scatter, children could become ill, enemies could approach. Winter could arrive before preparations were complete. The same mobility that offered freedom also made relationships essential. People had to know who would answer a call, who would provide shelter, and who might use weakness as an opportunity. These conditions formed the practical background to Temujin's later understanding of loyalty. He did not invent the importance of mutual support. He was born into a society where support was already tied to food, movement, and survival. What changed under him was the scale at which those bonds would eventually be organized. The skills of the herding camp would later appear in war. Careful attention to animals, endurance across distance, rapid relocation, disciplined use of limited supplies, and an ability to live beyond fixed roads. But at the beginning, these were not instruments of conquest. They were ways of protecting a household through another season. Before the empire, before titles and campaigns, there was the daily labor of keeping animals alive beneath a vast, uncertain sky. The steppe was not held together by a single government, a permanent frontier, or one shared authority. It was divided among families, lineages, camps, and larger political groupings whose names and alliances could change over time. Modern descriptions often use the word tribe, but the reality was less fixed than that word may suggest. People were connected by ancestry, marriage, friendship, obligation, and service. Yet these ties did not always point in the same direction. A man might belong to one lineage, marry into another network, follow a powerful leader, and maintain personal bonds that crossed older divisions. Political life therefore rested on relationships that had to be renewed. Gifts were exchanged, marriages arranged, promises made, and support demonstrated in moments of danger. A leader was important not only because of his birth, but because he could attract followers, distribute rewards, protect households, settle disputes, and create confidence that cooperation would continue. Reputation traveled across the grasslands through stories of generosity, courage, betrayal, and failure. Since people moved, news moved with them. A decision made in one camp could affect alliances far beyond the horizon. This was the human landscape into which Temujin was born. His father possessed status and connections, but those advantages were not permanent property that could simply be inherited without question. Authority existed because other people accepted it, and acceptance could weaken when circumstances changed. The childhood of Temujin would reveal this fragility with unusual clarity, but the conditions were already present before his family fell into danger. Every household understood that protection depended on who recognized its claims and who was willing to act when those claims were challenged. Marriage was one way of extending that protection. A union could connect families, create expectations of assistance, and reduce hostility between groups, though it could also become a source of conflict when agreements failed. Foster relationships and sworn bonds could carry political meaning as well. These connections did not erase competition. They created a web in which cooperation and rivalry existed together. The same person who offered help in one season might withdraw it in another if a stronger opportunity appeared. Loyalty was valued precisely because disloyalty was possible. The steppe did not produce constant warfare, and daily life contained long periods of herding, exchange, family labor, and negotiation. Yet violence remained an available tool when animals were stolen, insults were remembered, or leaders competed for followers. Raiding could transfer wealth quickly, while revenge could continue across generations. Captives might be absorbed, exchanged, enslaved, or attached to new households. Defeat did not always mean disappearance, but it could break a community into smaller pieces and redistribute its people. For Temujin, this unstable order was the true beginning of the later empire. He would eventually build a system that tried to redirect loyalty away from older divisions and toward a larger political structure centered on his rule. That achievement would not come from rejecting steppe society completely. It would come from understanding its deepest weakness. Blood ties could unite people, but they could also divide them into rival circles. A leader who depended only on inherited kinship remained limited by the size and quarrels of his own lineage. A leader able to bind unrelated followers through reward, discipline, and shared danger could reach further. Temujin had not yet learned how to do this when he was a child, and nothing about his birth guaranteed that he ever would. At the beginning, he was simply one boy inside a network of promises made by adults around him. Those promises seemed strong while his father lived. Their real strength would be tested only when the protection surrounding the family suddenly vanished. In that moment, the open steppe would reveal a harsher law. Ancestry could offer a name, but only living alliances could provide food, shelter, and safety. Without them, even a respected family could become almost invisible to others. The exact year of Temujin's birth remains uncertain, and historians have proposed several dates based on sources written after his childhood. What can be said with greater confidence is that he was born into the Borjigin lineage in the region of the Onon River, within a political world where ancestry mattered but did not guarantee lasting power. His father, Yasuge, was a recognized leader with followers, family connections, and the ability to negotiate alliances. He was not the ruler of a united Mongol nation, because no such state yet existed. His influence depended on people who accepted his leadership, rode with him, and expected protection or reward in return. For the young Temujin, this network formed the outer boundary of safety. It gave his household a place among other families and allowed decisions about marriage, movement, and conflict to be made from a position of some standing. The most important account of these early years is The Secret History of the Mongols, a Mongolian narrative written down after Temujin had become Genghis Khan. It preserves details unavailable elsewhere, yet it also combines political memory, family tradition, poetry, and dramatic storytelling. Its account cannot be treated as a perfect record of every conversation or event. Even so, the broad sequence it describes is widely accepted. While Temujin was still a boy, Yasuge died, and the structure protecting the family began to break apart. According to the narrative, Yasuge had taken Temujin to the family of Berte, the girl intended to become his wife. Temujin remained there temporarily, while his father started the journey home. On the way, Yesugei encountered a group of Tatars. Hospitality on the steppe usually carried strong expectations, but the Tatars reportedly recognized him as an old enemy and gave him poisoned food. Yesugei managed to return to his camp, where he became gravely ill and died soon afterward. The precise details cannot be independently confirmed, but his death at this stage of Temujin's life is central to every serious reconstruction of what followed. To understand its meaning, it is necessary to look beyond the loss of a parent. In a settled kingdom, an office, estate, or written law might preserve some authority after a leader died. On the steppe, leadership was more personal and more exposed. Yesugei's household possessed animals and lineage, but its security rested on living relationships. When he disappeared, the promises surrounding his family had to be renewed by people who were free to judge whether continued loyalty still served them. Temujin was too young to take his father's place, command experienced followers, or distribute enough rewards to hold the network together. His mother, Holan, had strength and knowledge, but the political expectations placed on a leader's widow were not the same as those attached to the man who had gathered the followers. This was the beginning of Temujin's transformation into an outcast, though the change did not occur in a single instant. First came uncertainty. Riders who had once approached the family because of Yesugei now had to choose another center of power. Relatives weighed obligations against risk. Households considered whether remaining close to a vulnerable widow and her children might draw them into conflict without offering protection in return. At the beginning of human life, dependence comes before independence, and Temujin's childhood exposed that truth in its political form. A child survives through a circle built by adults, but he does not control whether that circle remains. The future conqueror did not first encounter power as something he possessed. He encountered it as something that could vanish when one body stopped breathing. Yesugei's death did not make Temujin a leader. It removed the person whose presence had made leadership around him seem secure, leaving a family with a respected name but no certainty that anyone would continue to honor it. The steppe remained open, but their place within it had suddenly narrowed. After Yesugei's death, the family did not immediately lose every possession or every connection, but the balance around them changed. The followers who had accepted his leadership no longer saw a strong adult capable of protecting them, rewarding them, or guiding them through conflict. Holan remained with her children, yet a widow with young sons could not easily replace the authority that had held the group together. According to the traditional account, the households connected to Yesugei's people began to move away, leaving his family outside the protection of the larger community. The abandonment was not simply an act of cruelty by one group against another. It reflected the hard calculations of steppe politics, where loyalty often depended on strength, usefulness, and the belief that a leader could survive future danger. Staying beside a weakened household might mean sharing hunger, attracting enemies, and gaining little in return. For Temujin, however, these calculations became a daily reality. The loss of followers meant fewer animals, fewer hands, less information, and almost no protection against theft or attack. A family that had once belonged to a wider network now had to depend much more heavily on its own labor. Holan gathered what food the landscape could provide. The surviving tradition describes roots, wild plants, fish, and small animals, though the details should not be imagined as a complete record of every season. What matters is the broader condition. The family lived closer to scarcity and farther from the ordinary security of a supported pastoral household. This was not a noble retreat into nature. Hunger weakens judgment, narrows choices, and places pressure on relationships inside a family. Children who should have been protected by adults had to contribute to survival. Every task carried more weight because failure could not easily be absorbed by neighbors. The open country that had once supported movement now exposed their isolation. They could search for food, but they could not command access to the best pasture. They could remember old alliances, but memory alone did not bring riders back. Temujin's position became especially uncertain because lineage still gave him a name without giving him power. He belonged to a respected ancestry, yet respect without followers could not guard a camp or fill a cooking pot. In the long history of human communities, exclusion has often been as dangerous as physical hardship. People survive not only through individual strength, but through shared labor, stored knowledge, protection, and trust. Temujin's family experienced the removal of those supports while still living among people who knew who they were. Their suffering came not from being forgotten by the world, but from being judged too weak to deserve continued commitment. Inside the household, tension also grew. Yasuge had children through more than one union, and the limited food available increased rivalry among the older boys. The later killing of Temujin's half-brother Bekta, recorded in the Mongol tradition, shows how scarcity and authority could turn inward. It should not be treated as a simple childhood episode or as proof of an inevitable violent destiny. It reveals a household under pressure, where control over food and leadership had become matters of survival. Holun reportedly condemned the act, reminding her sons that enemies already surrounded them and that division within the family made them even more vulnerable. Temujin's earliest education in power, therefore, came from absence. He saw what happened when a household lost the person who connected it to others. He learned that birth did not prevent abandonment, that kinship did not erase competition, and that survival could depend on keeping people together when fear encouraged them to leave. These lessons did not yet make him a conqueror. They made him a boy who understood, long before he commanded armies, that isolation could destroy even those with a famous name. A circle could vanish, and rebuilding it would demand more than ancestry or inherited claims. Temujin's family survived abandonment, but survival did not restore the protection they had lost. As he grew older, his existence became a political problem for the Taichiud, a powerful group connected to his father's wider kin. A boy with the ancestry of a former leader could remain weak for years and still become dangerous if followers later gathered around him. The surviving Mongol account says that the Taichiud captured Temujin and placed a heavy wooden restraint around his neck. Historians generally accept that he experienced captivity, although the precise sequence, duration, and dramatic details come mainly from a narrative recorded after his rise. It is therefore safer to understand the episode through what it reveals than to treat every movement as certain. Temujin was not yet commanding warriors. He was a vulnerable young man held by people who believed they could decide whether his family's claim would continue. The wooden collar restricted his arms and made ordinary movement difficult. He was reportedly passed between households for guarding, a practice that spread responsibility and reduced the chance that one family alone would bear the consequences of his escape. His captivity showed how thoroughly his position had changed. He had been born into a respected lineage, yet lineage had not prevented others from treating him as a prisoner. The old circle around Yasuge had vanished, and no army appeared to rescue his son. According to the traditional story, Temujin escaped during a gathering when attention weakened. He struck or evaded the young guard assigned to him, reached the Onon River, and concealed himself in the water with only his face above the surface. A man named Sorkan Shira discovered him but did not expose him. Later, Sorkan Shira and members of his household concealed Temujin, removed the restraint, and helped him leave. The exact dialogue preserved in the account cannot be verified, yet the central memory is significant. Temujin's freedom depended on help from people who were not required by close blood relationship to save him. They accepted danger by protecting someone their own leaders considered an enemy. In the oldest human communities, survival has rarely belonged to physical strength alone. It has depended on whether another person chooses to share food, information, shelter, or silence at the necessary moment. Temujin's escape carried this ancient truth into his political education. A person outside the main line of authority could prove more valuable than a relative who withdrew support. Loyalty could arise from judgment and personal obligation rather than ancestry alone. This did not make Temujin immediately powerful. After escaping, he still returned to a family with limited resources, uncertain allies, and many reasons to remain cautious. Yet he had passed through an experience that exposed both sides of the social order surrounding him. The Taichiud used collective organization to confine him, while one household used private courage to break that control. Power could operate through fear, but protection could begin with a single decision not to betray someone. The roots of his later conquests are sometimes sought only in battle tactics or mounted speed. They also lie in these earlier lessons about human attachment. Temujin would eventually reward individuals who served him faithfully, sometimes raising people beyond the position expected from their birth. He would also punish disobedience with severity and use coercion on a far greater scale. His later system cannot be reduced to gratitude for one rescue, but the memory fitted a pattern already forming in his life. Inherited bonds had failed him, while chosen bonds could preserve him. The outcast who would one day unite much of the steppe was learning that a following had to be created, maintained, and remembered. His escape did not answer how he would conquer the known world. It revealed the smaller question that had to come first. How could a man abandoned by his own community persuade strangers to risk their safety for his future? When Temujin returned to the household of Berta's family after his father's death, the arrangement made years earlier still carried political meaning, but it no longer rested on the strength Yasuge had once possessed. Marriage on the steppe joined more than two individuals. It could connect households, create expectations of assistance, and place one family inside a wider network of obligation. For Temujin, whose own circle had nearly collapsed, the bond with Berta offered something his ancestry alone could no longer provide, a recognized relationship with people beyond his immediate family. The surviving Mongol narrative presents Berta as the daughter of Dasechen of the Ongerat, a group associated in later tradition with marriage alliances among ruling families. The details of the early betrothal come mainly from a source written after Temujin's rise, so the conversations cannot be treated as exact records. Yet the marriage itself, and Bertie's enduring place beside him, are central to the history of his household. Temujin did not approach her family as the secure son of a powerful leader. He came from years of deprivation, captivity, and uncertain status. Whatever respect his name still carried had to be supported by conduct, relationships, and the possibility that others might once again choose to stand with him. Berta entered a household that had survived through Holand's labour and the cooperation of children who had grown under pressure. Her arrival did not remove danger or instantly restore political standing. It added another relationship that had to be protected. A sable coat included in the marriage property later became useful when Temujin sought the support of Togrul, a ruler who had been allied with Yasuge. The object mattered because gifts on the steppe could renew memory and turn an old connection into a present obligation. Such exchanges did not function like written contracts enforced by distant courts. Their force came from memory, reputation, and the expectation that generosity would be answered. A gift could not guarantee permanent loyalty, but it could reopen a relationship that neglect had weakened. This was especially important for someone in Temujin's position. He needed older men to remember his father without seeing the son as a burden. He also needed new companions to believe that service beside him might lead to protection rather than abandonment. Temujin's strength was still too limited to compel such support. He had to ask, remind, exchange, and persuade. His rebuilding began through gestures smaller than conquest, each one joining a person or household to his uncertain future. Berta's importance also reached beyond the alliance formed by her marriage. She became the senior wife of Temujin and the mother of sons who would later stand at the center of imperial succession. Her position helped shape the continuity of the family he was creating, even though later disputes among those sons would show that family unity was never simple. Sources from the period rarely preserve women's experiences in their own voices, making it unwise to invent Berta's thoughts or reduce her to a symbol. What the record allows us to see is her political and dynastic significance, and the repeated effort Temujin made to recover and protect the bond that joined them. Human communities have long used marriage to move trust across the boundary of birth. The practice can provide cooperation, but it can also expose people to conflict when rival groups treat a spouse as a point of pressure. Temujin's marriage, therefore, gave him both connection and vulnerability. The man remembered for commanding vast armies was still learning to build a household stable enough to survive the next crisis. His path back from exclusion did not begin with a throne, a law, or a great victory. It began with relationships that others might honor or break, and with the quiet recognition that power had to be carried by families over time before it could ever be carried by an empire. The marriage between Temujin and Berta gave his household a renewed connection, but it did not make that household secure. Soon after they began living together, a Merkit raiding force attacked their camp. The surviving Mongol narrative presents the assault as retaliation for an older wrong. Years before, Yasuge had taken Hoelun, Temujin's mother, from a Merkit man. Whether every remembered motive can be reconstructed with certainty, the raid belonged to a familiar pattern in steppe politics, where injuries could remain active across generations and women could be seized within struggles between rival families. Temujin escaped with members of his household, but Berte was captured and carried away. This was a personal loss, a political humiliation, and a warning that his small following could still be broken by a stronger group. Later stories might tempt us to imagine every thought that passed through his mind, yet the evidence does not permit that. What can be seen is the decision he made afterward. He did not attempt a solitary rescue. He turned toward relationships that had been created before the attack, asking powerful allies to help him recover what his own strength could not protect. One of them was Togrul, often known by the later title Ongkhan, who had maintained a bond with Yasuge. Temujin had already renewed that connection through gifts and appeals to shared obligation. The other was Jamuka, a leader linked to Temujin by the ceremonial bond remembered as Anda, a form of sworn brotherhood. Togrul and Jamuka each possessed followers beyond Temujin's limited force. Their involvement changed the balance. The campaign against the Merkit therefore became more than a rescue. It demonstrated how political power on the steppe could be assembled from separate circles of loyalty, each brought together for a purpose that none might have achieved in the same way alone. The Allied force attacked the Merkit, and Berta was recovered. The exact size of the armies, the timing of every movement, and the words exchanged in the surviving account should not be treated as measurements recorded at the scene. The larger outcome is clear enough. Temujin regained his wife because he could activate alliances, not because he already ruled the people around him. This distinction lies near the beginning of the answer to how an outcast later conquered so much of Eurasia. His first important successes depended on recognizing weakness accurately. He knew when his own household was insufficient, and when survival required older obligations, chosen friendships, and coordinated action. The rescue also changed his standing. Men who rode beside him could now see him as someone capable of calling allies together, pursuing an enemy, and sharing the results of victory. Success attracted attention, while attention could attract new followers. Yet the event must not be cleaned of its human cost. The Merkit were not merely obstacles in a story of Temujin's rise. Their camps were attacked, people were killed or dispersed, and captives could be absorbed into other households. Berta herself had endured seizure and forced removal, but the sources do not preserve her experience in her own words. Soon after her return, she gave birth to Joki. Later disputes about his paternity appeared within the imperial family, especially when succession became politically important. No surviving evidence allows the question to be resolved with certainty, and Temujin publicly accepted Joki as his son. The uncertainty would remain inside the dynasty long after the rescue. The episode revealed a limit in the old order. An injury committed by one generation could return against the next, binding children to conflicts they had not begun. Temujin would later seek to reorganize inherited divisions, though violence remained central to his methods. For the moment, however, Temujin had recovered the central bond of his household and learned that power began not with standing alone, but with making other people believe that his struggle was also worth becoming theirs. The rescue of Berta gave Temujin more than the return of his wife. It showed that alliances could be called into action, and that success could make an uncertain leader more visible. Men who had known him only as Yasuge's weakened son could now see that he was able to gather support, pursue an enemy, and protect the household forming around him. Yet Temujin still did not possess a state, a permanent army, or authority accepted across the steppe. His strength remained personal. It lived in the willingness of people to ride beside him, share danger, and remain when easier loyalties were available elsewhere. Some of the earliest companions remembered in Mongol tradition illustrate this change. Buchu is said to have helped Temujin recover stolen horses. Instead of treating the encounter as temporary, the story presents Buchu as choosing to join him. Jelmi also became attached to Temujin's household and later served him through years of conflict. The exact words and circumstances preserved in the traditional narrative cannot be verified, but the broader pattern is important. Temujin was beginning to attract men whose commitment did not depend only on close descent from his lineage. They followed because of personal bonds, expected protection, shared opportunity, and the reputation growing around him. On the steppe, such companions could be described as men who attached themselves to a leader by choice. Their service was not modern employment, and it did not erase family connections. It created another layer of belonging. A follower might leave the authority of his birth group and place his future beside someone whose household appeared able to reward courage and remember assistance. Temujin understood the value of this choice because his early life had shown him the opposite. Relatives had withdrawn when his father died. A stranger's household had helped him escape captivity. Togrul had answered an appeal grounded in an older alliance, while Jamukha had joined the campaign through a sworn relationship. Again and again, survival depended on people deciding that a bond should be honoured. At the beginning of human community, trust must become practical before it becomes political. Someone keeps watch while another sleeps, returns an animal that could have been taken, shares information, or stands nearby when violence begins. Temujin's first following grew from acts of this scale. He did not yet control thousands. He was learning how a small circle becomes durable. Reward was central to that process. Pastoral wealth and goods taken in raids could be distributed, and a leader who shared gains could attract continued service. Protection mattered as well. Followers needed confidence that their households would not be discarded when circumstances changed. Temujin's later rule became severe and coercive, but his rise cannot be explained by fear alone. Before he could punish large numbers, he had to persuade a smaller number that remaining close to him was safer or more promising than returning to older loyalties. This did not create equality. Birth still mattered, aristocratic families remained powerful, and Temujin relied on relatives as well as companions. He was not replacing kinship with a modern system based purely on talent. He was widening the paths through which loyalty could reach him. A capable outsider could become useful. A defeated person might later be absorbed. Service remembered in hardship could shape future rank. Each new bond reduced his dependence on the lineage structures that had once abandoned his family. It also created tension with leaders whose authority rested on inherited position. The outcast was not yet overthrowing the old order, but he had begun building beside it. His household was becoming a place where blood, friendship, service, fear, and hope could be gathered into one following. That quiet change would eventually matter more than any single raid, because conquest would require not only riders who could move quickly, but people willing to believe that their separate futures belonged under the same command. Temujin and Jamukha emerged from the same unsettled world, where a leader's strength depended on moving households, remembered obligations, and the willingness of armed men to remain nearby. The surviving Mongol narrative describes them as Anda, a bond created by oath and exchange, rather than ordinary blood relationship. Later translations often call them sworn brothers, although the term carried political as well as personal meaning. It joined two men as partners who recognized one another as equals, at least when the bond was renewed. Their relationship therefore belonged to the steppe's older methods of creating trust beyond the family. Temujin, who had already learned how inherited loyalties could fail, gained in Jamukha a companion whose followers and standing extended far beyond his own weakened household. Jamukha, in turn, joined himself to a man whose name, determination, and growing circle offered future possibilities. The precise feelings between them cannot be recovered, and the speeches preserved in later tradition should not be heard as recorded conversation. What remains visible is a period of cooperation strong enough to influence Temujin's return to political life. Jamukha helped in the campaign that recovered Borte from the Merkit, and the two leaders later stayed together with their followers. For a time, their camps shared movement, protection, and opportunity. Beneath that closeness, however, stood a question that steppe alliances often postponed rather than solved. When two ambitious leaders occupied the same circle, whose judgment would finally guide it, both men understood the practical foundations of power. Followers needed pasture, security, reward, and confidence that a leader could answer injury. Both operated through alliances and inherited connections. Neither represented a completely modern or revolutionary idea of government, yet their networks began to pull people in different directions. The Mongol account presents Temujin as increasingly attractive to individuals and families willing to attach themselves to his household, including some who did not possess the highest inherited rank. Jamukha appears more closely associated with established aristocratic expectations, and with leaders who feared the changing balance around Temujin. This contrast must be handled carefully because the principal narrative was created within the political world established by Temujin's descendants. It had reasons to explain why his victory was legitimate, and why Jamukha's opposition failed. Jamukha should not be reduced to a proud guardian of a dying order, just as Temujin should not be transformed into a simple champion of ordinary people. Each depended on elites, warriors, relatives, and negotiated support. Their difference lay less in pure social principle than in the coalitions gathering around them, and in the kind of future those coalitions expected. Human groups have long faced a similar tension between belonging received at birth and belonging created through choice. On the steppe, that tension could determine where a household camped, whose animals it defended, and which leader its sons followed into danger. Temujin's rise widened the space for chosen service, but it also demanded deeper obedience to his own command. Jamukha's position drew strength from people who saw their status and independence threatened by that expansion. Their separation was therefore not merely the collapse of a friendship. It marked the beginning of a contest over how scattered communities might be joined and who would stand at the center. Nothing made Temujin's eventual victory inevitable. Jamukha was experienced, connected, and capable of gathering substantial support. At this stage, the future Genghis Khan was still one leader among several, dependent on alliances that could dissolve as quickly as they formed. The bond that had once protected both men was slowly becoming the boundary that separated their followers into rival political futures. The two men had crossed the same grasslands and learned the same necessity of loyalty, yet the social worlds forming around them could not remain equal forever. Before either could dominate the steppe, each would have to show whose promises carried farther when shared companionship gave way to divided command. The separation between Temujin and Jamukha did not immediately produce a clear contest with an obvious winner. Both men could gather riders, draw on older relationships, and appeal to households uncertain about where their safety would lie. Temujin had begun attracting followers who valued his protection and remembered his rewards, but his position remained fragile. Jamukha possessed wider connections among established leaders and could present himself as a defender of an order that many families already understood. When their rivalry moved into open conflict, Temujin faced an opponent who knew the same landscape, the same forms of warfare, and many of the same people. The confrontation usually associated with Dalan Balzut is difficult to date precisely, and the surviving accounts do not agree on every detail. The broad outcome, however, is widely accepted. Temujin suffered a serious defeat. This matters because later history can make his rise appear smooth, as though every hardship merely prepared an inevitable conqueror. Nothing, at that moment, guaranteed recovery. His followers could have scattered, stronger leaders could have absorbed them, and his name might have remained attached only to a failed attempt at leadership. Defeat on the steppe was not measured only by bodies left on the ground. It damaged confidence. Households deciding where to camp or whom to serve watched whether a leader could protect people from retaliation. A lost battle could remove animals, weapons, relatives, and the belief that future loyalty would be rewarded. Temujin had built his circle through personal commitment, but personal commitment was tested most severely when success disappeared. The earliest human communities survived through confidence that cooperation would continue during hunger, illness, and danger. A leader who inspired unity only when rewards were abundant had not created a durable group. Temujin now faced the older problem that had shaped his childhood. Would people remain when protection seemed uncertain, or would they leave as his father's followers had left his family? The historical record becomes especially unclear after this setback. Some years of Temujin's life cannot be reconstructed in a continuous narrative, and scholars have proposed different explanations for his activities and alliances. It would be misleading to fill that silence with invented adventures or to claim that one hidden experience transformed him. What can be traced is that he later returned to steppe politics with renewed connections, and that his rivalry with Jamukha did not end at their first major clash. The defeat may have revealed practical weaknesses in his coalition. A following based on separate personal ties could still break under pressure, unless it gained stronger discipline, clearer command, and a way to integrate people from different backgrounds. Temujin's later organization would answer these problems, but those answers were not yet complete. At Dalan Balzut, he was still learning the distance between attracting followers and controlling a force capable of surviving disaster. Jamukha's victory also showed that the older aristocratic networks remained powerful. Temujin was not sweeping aside a weak and exhausted order. He was challenging leaders who understood alliance, prestige, and violence as well as he did. His survival depended on withdrawing, preserving enough relationships to begin again, and waiting for political conditions to change. There was no certainty that they would. Across human history, most defeated claimants did not return. Their alliances dissolved, their descendants entered other communities, and their ambitions vanished without leaving a record. Temujin's later success should not be projected backward as proof that recovery was already assured. The man later remembered as Genghis Khan stood near the edge of historical disappearance, not because he lacked courage, but because courage could not replace numbers, coordination, resources, and trust. His first defeat, therefore, belongs at the center of his rise. It strips away the illusion that conquest grew from destiny. Before Temujin could unite the steppe, he had to learn why a leader might lose everything even after people had chosen to follow him. The rivalry between Temujin and Jamuka was not simply a struggle between two personalities. It revealed two different ways of gathering people in a society where birth, reputation, and military skill were deeply connected. Jamuka drew much of his strength from established aristocratic families and leaders whose authority rested on inherited standing. Temujin also relied on noble relatives and old alliances, but he increasingly made room for followers whose value came from service, courage, reliability, and usefulness in danger. The contrast should not be exaggerated into a contest between privilege and equality. Temujin did not create a modern social order, and he never abandoned hierarchy. What he changed was the route by which a person might approach power. A man of modest background who proved dependable could rise closer to the center, while a man of high birth who resisted command could lose influence. This was attractive to people whose abilities were greater than the place assigned to them by older custom. It was also threatening to leaders who feared that their inherited position might no longer protect them. Temujin's system began to weaken the old assumption that political loyalty should remain inside fixed kin groups. When individuals and households joined him, they were increasingly connected to his personal authority rather than only to the senior men of their birth lineages. That change made his following more flexible, but it also demanded stronger discipline. A coalition of separate families could collapse when leaders disagreed. Temujin therefore needed methods that would make obedience continue after friendship, kinship, or immediate advantage had begun to fade. Reward helped. He distributed livestock, captured goods, offices, and protection in ways that encouraged service. Memory also mattered. Assistance given during hardship could be remembered years later, turning past loyalty into future rank. Yet generosity alone could not hold together an expanding force. Temujin punished betrayal, desertion, and unauthorized action with increasing severity. The same leader who welcomed useful outsiders also expected them to accept a command structure that limited older independence. This combination of opportunity and control gave his coalition a different shape from Jamuka's. It offered advancement, but only within an order centered on Temujin. The roots of this approach reach back to his earliest experience as an abandoned child. His family had learned that shared ancestry could fail when no practical obligation remained. Later, during captivity and recovery, help had come from people whose choices mattered more than blood. Temujin did not merely repeat these lessons as personal memories. He translated them into political practice. A follower had to be bound by what he received, what he owed, and what he expected from the future. Jamuka's supporters could view this as a dangerous concentration of power. Temujin's followers could view it as protection from the instability of competing aristocrats. Neither vision was peaceful. Both depended on armed force, raids, coercion, and the ability to defeat rivals. The difference lay in how victory would be organized afterward. Jamuka's coalition tended to preserve the standing of established leaders, while Temujin increasingly broke defeated groups apart and redistributed their members under new commanders. This reduced the chance that old loyalties would immediately reform against him. It also widened the number of people whose future depended directly on his success. Human societies often become more durable when cooperation extends beyond family, but that expansion can also place greater power in the hands of those who control the larger structure. Temujin's rise followed both possibilities at once. He created a broader political community, yet he built it around obedience to himself. That possibility would draw supporters, enemies, and uncertain families toward him. The contest with Jamuka was therefore not only about who would rule the steppe, It was about whether the steppe would remain a field of competing inherited circles, or become a more tightly organized order in which loyalty could cross bloodlines but could no longer remain divided. Victory on the steppe did not automatically leave a conqueror with a stable population to govern. Defeated leaders might escape, surviving households might regroup, and old loyalties could draw people back into resistance when conditions changed. Temujin gradually answered this problem by treating conquered communities not only as enemies to be punished, but also as human resources that could be separated from their former commanders and attached to a new order. The process was often violent. Some opponents were killed, some families were displaced, and some captives lost control over where they would live or whom they would serve. Integration did not mean mercy in a modern sense. It meant that destruction was combined with absorption, allowing Temujin to enlarge his following while weakening the social structures that had opposed him. When a rival group submitted, its people did not always remain together under the same hereditary leaders. Households could be divided and placed among units loyal to Temujin. Men capable of military service could be assigned under commanders chosen for reliability, while craftsmen, herders, servants, and dependents entered the wider economy of the growing coalition. By breaking the connection between defeated populations and the leaders who had once directed them, Temujin reduced the chance that an old alliance could simply recover after one lost battle. A defeated name might survive, but the people who had carried it could now be distributed across different camps and commands. This approach grew from conditions older than Temujin himself. Pastoral communities had long absorbed captives, welcomed dependents, and reorganized households after conflict. Human societies often survive disruption by incorporating outsiders rather than eliminating them. Temujin extended that familiar practice into a more deliberate political method. He understood that land alone could not make him powerful. The steppe offered enormous distances, but power came from people who tended animals, carried messages, repaired equipment, raised children, guarded camps, and rode when summoned. Every absorbed household increased the labor and military strength available to him, provided that its members could be prevented from returning to former loyalties. Rewards supported this transformation. Those who accepted the new order might receive protection, a place within a unit, access to pasture, or a share of captured wealth. Individuals who proved useful could rise, even when their birth had placed them far from the center of older aristocratic networks. At the same time, refusal could bring severe punishment. Temujin's expanding community offered a future, but it did not offer unrestricted choice. The possibility of advancement existed beside coercion, and both helped hold the new structure together. This mixture explains why former enemies could later appear among his commanders and followers without turning the story into one of simple reconciliation. Some may have recognized opportunity, others had few safe alternatives. Many likely adapted because their families depended on surviving within the order that now controlled them. The result was a political body less tied to a single ancestry than the coalitions Temujin had known as a child. It was still built from families, herds, and personal relationships, but those smaller circles were increasingly placed inside a larger chain of command. The outcast who had once lost protection was learning to make departure more difficult for others. He offered belonging, yet he also reorganized belonging so that loyalty flowed upward toward him. Conquest, therefore, became more than defeating an enemy in the field. It became the controlled movement of people from one identity into another, from inherited allegiance toward assigned service. Each incorporated group also brought knowledge of routes, pasture, neighboring rivals, and local resources. The conqueror gained not only more riders but a memory of the landscape through people who had once stood against him. This was one of the quiet mechanisms behind Temujin's rise. Armies could win battles, but only the absorption of human communities could turn repeated victories into a power large enough to endure beyond the next season. As Temujin's following grew, attraction alone was no longer enough to hold it together. Men could join because they expected protection, pasture, captured goods, or a chance to rise. But those expectations had to be answered in ways that appeared consistent. A leader who rewarded only relatives would push useful outsiders away. A leader who distributed everything without discipline would lose control. Temujin's emerging system joined generosity to strict command. creating a form of trust based not on affection alone, but on the belief that service would be noticed and disobedience would carry consequences. The surviving sources repeatedly emphasize his habit of remembering assistance given during difficult moments. Men who had helped him when he was poor, endangered, or politically weak could later receive responsibility far beyond what their birth might once have allowed. Borchu, Jelmi, and other early companions became important not simply because they were brave, but because their loyalty had been tested before success made loyalty easy. This memory gave Temujin's followers a practical reason to believe that service could shape rank. Their future did not depend entirely on the position inherited from their fathers. Yet advancement was never open without limits. Temujin remained surrounded by relatives, aristocrats, and powerful families, and his rule did not erase inequality. What changed was the balance between lineage and demonstrated usefulness. A man of high birth could not assume that ancestry excused failure, while a man of lower standing might gain authority if he carried out orders, protected others, and remained loyal under pressure. This encouraged people from different backgrounds to attach their ambitions to Temujin's success. Reward also had to reach beyond individual warriors. Livestock, food, clothing, tools, and captured property supported households, children, servants, and dependents. When wealth was distributed, it helped entire camps survive and made the leader's victories visible in ordinary life. A horse received after battle could improve movement, herding, and defense. Animals added to a weakened household could help it recover across several seasons. Political loyalty therefore entered the body through food, shelter, warmth, and security. Temujin's power became real when followers could feel that remaining near him reduced some of the uncertainty that had shaped life on the steppe. Discipline gave the arrangement its harder edge. Raiding forces that broke formation, hid captured goods, abandoned companions, or acted without permission could damage the whole coalition. Temujin increasingly demanded that gains be reported and distributed according to command, rather than seized entirely by those who reached them first. Such rules limited the independence of individual warriors and senior leaders, but they also reduced quarrels over spoils and made coordinated action more possible. Obedience was not maintained gently. Punishment could be severe, and fear formed part of the order he built. The same system that rewarded loyalty could destroy those judged treacherous. Trust and coercion were therefore not opposites within his rise. They worked together. Followers trusted that service might be remembered, while also knowing that refusal could be dangerous. This combination allowed Temujin to manage people whose families had once fought one another. They did not need to forget every older identity immediately. They needed to behave according to a shared command when moving, fighting, dividing wealth, or guarding a camp. Over time, repeated cooperation could produce new loyalties stronger than the rivalries from which the followers had come. The outcast who had once watched adults abandon his mother was now constructing a world in which loyalty became measurable through action. He could not guarantee safety, and his campaigns would expose many people to suffering. But he offered followers a clearer exchange than the unstable promises of temporary alliance. Serve faithfully, and protection, reward, and advancement might follow. Resist or betray the common order, and punishment could be final. This was not yet an empire, but it was becoming something more durable than any gathering of riders around a successful raid could ever provide. Temujin's growing army was not simply a gathering of riders who appeared for battle and returned to separate lives afterward. It became a framework for organizing people, households, responsibilities, and movement. Mongol forces were arranged through a decimal structure, with groups commonly described in units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Similar forms of organization had existed in Inner Asia before Temujin, so he did not invent the principle from nothing. His importance lay in applying it more systematically across a coalition made from rival lineages, defeated peoples, old companions, and newly attached followers. A small unit placed men close enough to know one another's behavior. Larger formations connected those smaller circles to commanders responsible for discipline, supplies, communication, and coordinated action. The arrangement made orders easier to transmit across a force spread over wide ground. It also made responsibility more visible. If riders deserted, concealed booty, abandoned companions, or failed to report, command could trace the failure through an established chain. Military organization, therefore, reduced some of the uncertainty that had weakened earlier alliances. Men were no longer expected to fight only beside relatives or under the senior figure of their birth group. Temujin could separate families and warriors from former leaders, then assign them within formations that joined people from different backgrounds. Old loyalties did not disappear at once, but daily cooperation created new obligations. Riders trained, traveled, guarded animals, shared danger, and depended on one another for survival. Over time, the unit itself could become a practical community. The structure reached beyond men carrying bows. Every mounted force depended on herds, remounts, food, equipment, messengers, servants, craftsmen, and families maintaining life behind movement. A commander responsible for warriors also stood within a wider social body that had to feed children, protect camps, recover animals, and prepare for seasonal change. The army was therefore inseparable from the pastoral society that sustained it. Temujin's political achievement was to place more of that society under one order without turning it into a settled bureaucracy overnight. He used familiar habits of mobility and mutual dependence, then connected them to a command system larger than any single clan. The consequences were profound. A leader who once controlled only his own relatives could no longer easily withdraw with them if those relatives had been distributed among several units. A defeated aristocrat might retain status, but his former followers could now answer to commanders chosen by Temujin. A capable officer could rise because the men under him performed well, while failure could bring removal or punishment. Authority became less dependent on a single inherited circle and more dependent on service within the wider organization. Yet the system did not free individuals from hierarchy. It placed them inside a stricter one. Its strength came from making thousands of separate decisions predictable: where riders assembled, whom they obeyed, how captured wealth moved, and which households supported each formation. Order did not remove hardship, but it allowed hardship to be carried more collectively. Movement, battle, distribution, and obedience were increasingly regulated from above. The same structure that offered protection could also compel service and carry violence into distant lands. Human beings had always formed groups to survive, but Temujin expanded the scale of coordinated belonging. The household remained important, the lineage remained remembered, and personal loyalty still mattered, yet each was now enclosed within a broader military society. That society could move quickly because its members already knew how to live from animals and changing pasture. It could remain coherent because command linked each small group to the next. Temujin had begun life in a family abandoned when its protective circle collapsed. He was now building a circle designed not to collapse when one alliance weakened or one noble withdrew. By turning the army into a social structure, he created the instrument that would soon unite the steppe and make conquest beyond it possible. By the opening years of the 13th century, Temujin had become more than the leader of a growing household, but he still did not command the entire steppe. Powerful rivals remained, each supported by families, commanders, and memories of earlier alliances. Among the most important were Togrul and the Kherite, who had once helped Temujin recover Borte and the Naiman Confederation farther west. Their presence reminds us that Temujin's rise did not follow a straight line from friendship to victory. Alliances changed because leaders feared one another's growth, disputed rank, or believed that cooperation had become more dangerous than conflict. Togrul had been connected to Temujin through Yesugei and had served as both protector and partner. For years, the relationship benefited them both. Temujin gained support from an established ruler, while Togrul gained a capable ally against his own enemies. Yet as Temujin attracted more followers and organized them under direct command, the balance between the two men altered. A younger leader who had once requested help was becoming strong enough to threaten the independence of the older coalition. Suspicion deepened, negotiations failed, and open conflict followed. The struggle with the Kherite did not end through one effortless victory. Temujin faced danger, lost ground, regrouped, and relied on the loyalty of people who remained when his position again appeared uncertain. His eventual defeat of the Kherite removed one of the largest political centers on the eastern steppe. Some opponents were killed or scattered, while many survivors were absorbed into his expanding organization. The pattern repeated what he had learnt earlier. Conquest became durable only when defeated people were separated from former command and given a place, willing or unwilling, inside a new structure. This process carried severe human costs. Families were displaced, leaders were executed, and communities lost the freedom to decide where their loyalties would remain. Temujin's unification was not a peaceful agreement among equal groups. It was built through negotiation, fear, reward, and repeated violence. Its roots, however, still reach back to the beginning of his life. The abandoned boy had once watched a protective circle disappear after one leader died. The adult commander now tried to construct an order that would not depend on fragile friendship between rival nobles. He did this by moving loyalty downward into small units and upward toward a single command. After the Kherate were broken, the Nayman remained a major obstacle. Their leaders could draw support from people who resisted Temujin, including figures connected to Jamukha's coalition. The campaign against them tested whether his reorganized forces could act across greater distance while maintaining coordination. Temujin's army advanced with discipline, used information carefully, and presented itself as larger or more threatening than opponents expected. Later traditions preserve dramatic details, but the broad outcome is clear. The Nayman leadership was defeated, and much of its population entered the political body Temujin was creating. Jamukha's remaining position also collapsed. Accounts of his final capture and death differ in detail, and speeches attributed to the two former companions cannot be verified as exact words. What matters is that the long rivalry ended with Temujin as the dominant leader among the Mongol and neighboring steppe peoples. Even then, unification did not mean that every person accepted him willingly or that resistance vanished forever. It meant that no rival coalition remained strong enough to challenge his command on the same scale. Years of changing alliances, defeats, recoveries, and forced incorporation had produced something the steppe had rarely sustained for long: a broad political order capable of directing many peoples at once. Temujin had not yet become Genghis Khan, and he had not yet crossed into the great campaigns that would make his name known across Eurasia. But the essential transformation had occurred. The outcast no longer depended on another ruler's protection. He had become the center around which protection, ambition, fear, and survival were now tightly organized together. In 1206, after years of warfare, shifting alliances, and forced absorption, Temujin stood at the center of a political order larger than any following he had previously commanded. A great assembly was held near the upper Onon River, where leading members of the victorious coalition recognized him as their supreme ruler. Such gatherings were not unfamiliar on the steppe. Important decisions could be confirmed through councils in which rulers, commanders, relatives, and other powerful figures displayed agreement before the wider community. Yet this assembly carried unusual weight because the balance of power had already been settled through conflict. The Kherate leadership had fallen, the Nayman coalition had been broken, Jamukha no longer offered an alternative center, and many surviving communities had been redistributed within Temujin's organization. The gathering did not create his authority from nothing. It gave public form to a transformation that had taken many years and cost many lives. Temujin was now granted the name or title Genghis Khan, commonly rendered in English as Genghis Khan. The original meaning of Genghis remains debated, and proposed translations such as universal ruler, oceanic ruler, firm ruler, or fierce ruler should not be presented as settled fact. What mattered politically was clearer than what the word may once have meant. Temujin was no longer merely the head of one lineage or the strongest member of a temporary alliance. He was being recognized as the ruler of a newly united people whose identity was increasingly connected to his command. The old divisions did not vanish. Families remembered ancestry, defeated leaders left resentments, and regional differences remained. Public recognition nevertheless created a shared point above those divisions. The man once abandoned after his father's death had become the person through whom status, protection, appointment, and military duty were increasingly defined. This reversal was not only personal, it changed the meaning of belonging across the steppe. Temujin's followers had begun as separate households joined by kinship, need, friendship, reward, or fear. Under Genghis Khan, they could be imagined as members of a larger political community, often described in the sources as the Great Mongol Polity. That community was still mobile, pastoral, and dependent on animals, but it now possessed a command capable of directing people over long distances. The assembly also confirmed obligations. Leaders received positions, military units remained tied to commanders, and service to the new ruler gained a legitimacy that extended beyond private loyalty. A decision once negotiated between two men could now be presented as a duty owed to the wider order. This made cooperation more stable, but it also concentrated authority. Genghis Khan could reward families that supported him and punish those who resisted. The political shelter he built for his followers was inseparable from the power to compel them. At the beginning of human society, larger communities often emerge when smaller groups accept common rules that reduce conflict within the group. The Mongol unification followed that pattern through distinctly steppe institutions. Yet, internal coordination did not end violence. It redirected much of it outward. Riders who had spent years fighting neighboring communities could now move under one command towards societies beyond the grasslands. The ceremony also transformed memory into authority. Hardship could now be retold as proof that the ruler had endured abandonment, captivity, defeat, and rivalry before earning recognition. Such memory strengthened legitimacy among supporters, but it should not be mistaken for destiny, because victory had depended on choices made by thousands of other people. The assembly of 1206 therefore marked both an ending and a beginning. It closed the long contest over who would dominate the eastern steppe, while creating a ruler whose ambitions and obligations could no longer be contained there. Temujin had survived exclusion by learning how to make loyalty cross the boundaries of blood. As Genghis Khan, he now possessed the structure that could carry those loyalties beyond the world that had formed him. Recognition in 1206 gave Genghis Khan a title, but a title alone could not govern people scattered across enormous distances. His new political order required more than mounted warriors and personal loyalty. Commands had to be remembered accurately, appointments had to be known, tribute had to be collected, disputes had to be judged, and information had to travel between camps that might be separated by days of riding. The society that had created him remained mobile, yet the scale of his authority now demanded tools usually associated with more settled states. Genghis Khan responded by borrowing knowledge from people whose traditions differed from his own. One important step was the adoption of a written form for the Mongol language based on the script used by the Uyghurs. Tradition associates this work with the Uyghur scribe Tatar Tonga, who entered Mongol service after the defeat of the Naiman. The exact development cannot be reconstructed in every detail, but writing clearly became essential to the emerging state. Orders, appointments, diplomatic messages, and records could now endure beyond the memory of a single messenger. A spoken command vanished when its hearers died or disagreed about what had been said. A written command could be carried, copied, stored, and shown again. Literacy did not suddenly spread through every household, and oral communication remained central, but trained scribes gave the ruler a new way to extend his presence across distance. Genghis Khan also relied on officials drawn from conquered or allied peoples. Uyghurs, Khitans, and others possessed experience in writing, taxation, diplomacy, and administration. Their service shows that Mongol expansion was never sustained by ethnic Mongols alone. The conquerors could move quickly because they were willing to use skills that pastoral society had not developed in the same form. Ability to absorb outside knowledge became as important as ability to defeat outside armies. Messengers formed another vital link. Riders carried orders between commanders, reported movements, summoned forces, and maintained contact across the steppe. More regular relay systems would be developed further under later rulers, especially Ogode, so it would be inaccurate to place every mature imperial institution fully within Genghis Khan's lifetime. Yet the need was already clear. An army moving in several directions could not remain coordinated if information travelled slowly or depended on chance encounters. Fresh horses, recognized authority, and protected routes allowed messages to move faster than ordinary travellers. Administration also grew through appointment. Commanders were assigned responsibility for military units, households, territories, and tasks. Some positions went to relatives, while others were given to companions whose loyalty had been tested or specialists whose knowledge was necessary. The arrangement remained personal, but it was becoming more durable than a network of private friendships. Responsibility could be attached to an office and placed within a chain of command. At the beginning of human political life, cooperation grows when memory is shared beyond one mind. A rule becomes stronger when many people can repeat it. A duty becomes clearer when others can identify who carries it, and a community becomes larger when messages can cross the space separating its members. Genghis Khan's government developed through these simple needs on an extraordinary scale. It did not erase older customs or create a finished bureaucracy in one moment. It joined steppe leadership to borrowed administrative methods, allowing a mobile society to direct resources, people, and violence far beyond its original homeland. The transformation mattered because conquest repeatedly carried him beyond familiar grasslands, into regions where cities, farms, markets, and established courts demanded forms of control that cavalry alone could never provide for long. The outcast who had once depended on another family's silence now ruled through scribes, messengers, commanders, and appointed servants. His power no longer travelled only in his own body. It could move through words carried by strangers, through marks written on a page, and through duties performed by people he might never meet. The unification of the steppe gave Genghis Khan command over many people, herds, and routes, but it did not make his new polity economically complete. Pastoral life provided meat, milk, felt, hides, transport, fuel, and much of the material needed for survival. It also produced horses and livestock that neighbouring societies valued. Yet the grasslands did not supply every object desired by households, commanders, or an expanding court. Grain, woven textiles, metal tools, weapons, luxury goods, and the work of specialized craftsmen often came from settled regions beyond the steppe. Exchange was therefore not an optional decoration added after conquest. It had long connected mobile herders with farmers, merchants, towns, and states along the borders of Mongolia. Animals, hides, wool, and horses could move outward, while agricultural and manufactured goods moved inward. The exact balance varied by place and year, especially when weather-damaged herds or political conflict interrupted familiar routes. A severe winter or dry season could reduce animals, narrow food supplies, and make access to outside goods more urgent. This vulnerability does not mean that pastoral society was primitive or helpless. It means that, like every human economy since communities first began specializing their labor, it depended on exchange with people who produced different things. The new Mongol order inherited that dependence on a much larger scale. Genghis Khan now had followers who expected protection and rewards, commanders who required equipment, and households whose survival remained tied to animals vulnerable to climate and disease. Unification ended many internal wars, but it also concentrated needs around one ruler. Wealth captured or received from beyond the steppe could be distributed to maintain loyalty, while interrupted commerce could appear not merely inconvenient, but politically dangerous. Relations with neighbouring states therefore moved across a wide range. Peaceful trade could benefit both sides. Diplomatic gifts could confirm status and open access. Tribute could express an unequal relationship without requiring permanent occupation. Raiding could seize goods quickly, though it also damaged the very networks that made continued exchange possible. War might begin from several pressures at once, including strategic fear, failed diplomacy, disputed authority, opportunity, and the ambitions of leaders. Historians have not agreed on one simple cause that explains the Mongol expansion, and the conquest should not be reduced to hunger, climate, or an automatic conflict between nomads and farmers. Genghis Khan made choices within conditions that offered several possible paths. His newly united forces gave him the ability to demand more favourable relations, but neighbouring rulers had their own interests and did not necessarily accept his claims. The frontier between steppe and settled land had never been a clean boundary between two separate worlds. For generations, people crossed it as merchants, envoys, migrants, captives, soldiers, and marriage partners. Languages, objects, techniques, and information travelled with them. The origin of Genghis Khan's outward movement lay partly in this older human habit of depending on strangers while fearing the power they held over essential resources. A community may produce most of what keeps its body alive, yet still rely on distant hands for the tools that strengthen it, the grain that supports it in crisis, or the symbols that display rank. Once Genghis Khan controlled the eastern steppe, he also controlled a greater ability to protect trade, redirect it, tax it, or replace negotiation with force. His army had been created from pastoral mobility, but its continued loyalty required flows of wealth larger than ordinary herding could reliably provide. Looking beyond the grasslands was therefore not a sudden rejection of the world that formed him. It was an extension of relationships that had always joined that world to its neighbours. The answer would be shaped by border politics, rival courts, remembered grievances, and the confidence that recent victories had created. The question was no longer whether the Mongols would interact with settled states, but whether those interactions would proceed through exchange, submission, or war. The first campaigns beyond the newly united steppe brought Genghis Khan into sustained conflict with Western Xia, a kingdom ruled by the Tangut people along the northwestern approaches to China. Western Xia occupied a strategic zone between grasslands, deserts, mountain corridors, and settled agricultural regions. Its rulers controlled fortified towns, trade routes, farms, and administrative centres, unlike the mobile camps that had shaped Mongol political life. For Genghis Khan, this neighbouring state offered wealth, security, and a test of whether his new order could operate beyond familiar pasture. Mongol forces had raided Western Xia before 1206, but the larger campaign beginning in 1209 placed greater demands on them. Riders trained to move across open land could surround scattered enemies and strike supply lines, yet walls changed the nature of war. Horses could carry warriors quickly to a city, but speed alone could not open gates, cross defensive works, or feed an army waiting outside. The Mongols therefore had to learn how conquest slowed when people gathered behind stone and packed earth. They also had to manage water, fodder, food, and communication in country where large mounted forces could exhaust nearby resources. These problems did not immediately transform them into expert siege armies. Their abilities developed through experience, captured knowledge, and assistance from people familiar with engineering and settled warfare. Accounts of individual operations differ, and dramatic stories about flooding cities or overwhelming defences should be treated carefully when sources conflict. The broad result is more secure. Western Xia eventually accepted Mongol demands, offered tribute, and entered an unequal relationship with Genghis Khan, although it retained its own ruler and government. This was not complete annexation, and submission did not end later tension. It showed that the Mongols could force a neighbouring state to recognise their power without yet occupying every district or replacing its administration. The campaign also taught Genghis Khan that settled kingdoms could be used as sources of supplies, specialists, diplomatic support, and military assistance. A conquered or subordinated society offered more than treasure. It contained scribes who could record orders, craftsmen who could make equipment, engineers who understood fortifications, farmers who produced grain, and officials who knew how to collect and move resources. The steppe had given the Mongols mobility, endurance, and command through personal loyalty. Contact with Western Xia showed what those strengths lacked when directed against cities. At the beginning of organised human settlement, walls allowed communities to store food, protect specialists, and remain in one place during danger. Those same walls forced attackers to remain nearby, exposing them to hunger, disease, weather, and counterattack. Genghis Khan's forces now had to connect the quick rhythm of mounted warfare with the slower labour of siege and administration. This learning process mattered more than any single victory. The men who had united the grasslands were entering a world where control depended not only on defeating armies, but on managing populations that could not simply move with the conqueror. Western Xia became an early bridge between steppe war and imperial war. It also revealed a limit that would follow every later campaign. Destruction could produce obedience for a season, but lasting rule required food, records, intermediaries, and arrangements through which conquered communities continued working after the army had moved onward. It revealed that expansion required adaptation, and that adaptation often came from absorbing the knowledge of those being pressured or defeated. Genghis Khan did not abandon the methods that had raised him from exclusion. He widened them. Just as he had once brought former enemies into his military units, he now began drawing the skills of settled societies into his larger political system. The outcast had learned to build power by making different people serve one command. Beyond the steppe, that principle would have to include not only riders and herders, but engineers, officials, artisans, and cities whose daily lives followed a rhythm entirely different from his own. After compelling Western Xia to accept an unequal peace, Genghis Khan turned toward a far larger power to the southeast. The Jin dynasty, ruled by the Jurchens, controlled much of northern China, including rich agricultural lands, fortified cities, markets, workshops, and roads that connected densely settled communities. It was not a weak state waiting to collapse. Its rulers commanded armies, collected taxes, maintained walls, and governed millions of people through institutions far more elaborate than those of the steppe. Yet the Jin also faced internal strains, frontier tensions, and the difficulty of defending a long border against highly mobile enemies. Relations between the Jin court and the peoples of Mongolia had included trade, tribute, diplomacy, interference, and war long before Genghis Khan. Older Jurchen policies had sometimes encouraged division among steppe groups, and memories of conflict remained active. By 1211, the newly united Mongol forces were strong enough to cross the frontier and challenge the dynasty directly. The invasion did not proceed as a single march toward one capital. Mongol armies moved through several routes, attacked field forces, bypassed some strong points, and used speed to prevent the Jin from concentrating their strength. Open country favored riders who could travel with remounts, gather information, and change direction before slower armies understood their purpose. Fortified places remained more difficult. The Mongols increasingly depended on defectors, captives, engineers, and specialists familiar with siege methods. Their growth again came through absorption. Knowledge taken from one conquered community helped them confront the next. Genghis Khan also benefited from divisions within the Jin realm. Some commanders surrendered, local groups changed allegiance, and peoples who resented Jurchen rule could see the Mongols as useful allies, although such choices did not guarantee safety. Conquest created opportunities for some and catastrophe for others. Farms were damaged, towns were attacked, populations fled, and civilians faced hunger, displacement, captivity, or death. Exact totals reported in later accounts are often difficult to verify, so the scale of suffering should be acknowledged without repeating uncertain numbers. In 1215, Mongol forces captured Zhongdu, the Jin capital located in the area of present-day Beijing, after the court had moved its main seat south to Kaifeng. The fall of Zhongdu carried enormous symbolic and material importance. A ruler born among mobile camps had forced one of Eurasia's great dynasties from its northern capital. Yet this victory did not mean that Genghis Khan had conquered all of China, or even destroyed the Jin dynasty. The Jin continued to rule substantial territories south of the Yellow River and resisted for years. Genghis Khan left commanders, especially Mukhali, to continue operations while he later directed attention elsewhere. Campaigning there also exposed a new logistical reality over time. Large mounted forces could not depend indefinitely on nearby pasture, especially around cities where animals and people consumed supplies rapidly. Grain stores, transport animals, local guides, and organized collection became increasingly important, binding military success to administrative control. The dynasty was not finally eliminated until 1234, after Genghis Khan's death, through campaigns conducted under his successors and with assistance from the Southern Song. This distinction is essential to the central question of his life. His reputation would eventually expand beyond the lands he personally subdued, combining his victories with those of children and grandchildren. What he achieved against the Jin was still extraordinary, but it was incomplete. He had shown that the organization created from abandoned households, defeated tribes, and chosen loyalty could cross walls and enter agricultural empires. The horsemen of the steppe were learning to command engineers, administrators, and surrendered soldiers from settled societies. Their power came not from remaining unchanged, but from carrying the oldest skills of movement into new environments and adding whatever knowledge conquest placed within reach. The OUTCAST had opened northern China to Mongol rule, but the task of holding and completing that conquest would belong to a political system larger and longer-lived than one man. The Mongol armies did not move quickly, because their riders possessed a mysterious quality unavailable to others. Their speed grew from a way of life developed over many generations on the steppe, where distance was ordinary and horses were woven into daily survival. A herding family needed animals for travel, work, communication, protection, and status. Children learned to ride young, not as preparation for conquest, but because mounted movement helped them watch livestock, visit neighboring camps, and respond to sudden changes in weather or danger. By the time Temujin united the steppe, he commanded people whose bodies, habits, and expectations had already been shaped by constant contact with horses. Mongol warriors commonly traveled with more than one mount, changing horses as they moved so that no single animal carried the burden continuously. This practice allowed a force to cover long distances while preserving enough strength for scouting, hunting, retreat, or battle. It also reduced dependence on fixed roads. Where pasture and water were available, mounted groups could spread across broad country, gather again, and approach from directions that settled armies did not always expect. The horses themselves were generally smaller than the large war horses admired in some agricultural societies, but they were well suited to the environment that produced them. They could live on sparse grazing, endure cold conditions, and remain useful when cared for by riders who understood their needs. These qualities should not be exaggerated into invulnerability. Horses still required grass, water, rest, and protection. Severe weather, exhausted pasture, disease, and poor planning could weaken an army as surely as an enemy. Mongol mobility worked because commanders paid close attention to the limits of animals rather than pretending those limits did not exist. Each rider carried equipment chosen for movement. The composite bow could be used from horseback, while clothing, food containers, ropes, tools, and weapons had to remain manageable over distance. Supplies were not absent, but they were organized around a society accustomed to carrying much of its life with animals. The same felt, leather, preserved foods, and practical knowledge that sustained a household also supported men riding far from home. This was one reason the army could operate in places where a force dependent on long wagon trains might move more slowly. Yet the Mongols did not live entirely from the land, and later campaigns required grain, captured stores, transport animals, and organized support from conquered populations. The image of riders crossing continents without supply problems hides the careful labor behind their movement. Riders depended on knowledge shared across units: which valleys held water, where snow remained, when a river could be crossed, and how long animals could graze before a camp had to move. Such information was part of planning because the army's strength rested on the condition of its herds. Herds had to be managed, remounts protected, routes examined, and reports delivered. At the beginning of Temujin's life, a horse had helped one family reach pasture or escape danger. Under Genghis Khan, the same relationship between human bodies, animals, and open space was coordinated across thousands of riders. Speed became political because it allowed commands to arrive before rivals could unite. It became psychological because an army reported far away could appear nearby sooner than expected. It became strategic because riders could separate, gather information, avoid strong positions, and concentrate where an opponent was weakest. None of these advantages came from the horse alone. They came from the union of animal endurance, human skill, disciplined organization, and knowledge of landscape. The empire began beneath riders because the steppe had taught generations to think through movement. Genghis Khan transformed that inherited knowledge into a system capable of carrying his authority beyond the horizon. But every distant campaign still depended on the living creature beneath each warrior, breathing, feeding, tiring, and making possible the pace that made Mongol power seem larger than the space it occupied. Speed became dangerous only when it was guided by information. Mongol commanders did not simply ride faster than their opponents and hope that movement would create victory. They sent scouts ahead, watched roads and river crossings, questioned travelers and captives, and studied the condition of pasture, water, and enemy forces. Reports allowed separate columns to move across wide spaces without losing sight of a shared purpose. A commander could avoid a strong position, strike an exposed supply line, or delay battle until scattered units were ready to gather. The result was not perfect knowledge. Scouts could fail, guides could mislead, weather could hide movement, and reports could arrive too late. Yet the habit of seeking information before committing the main force reduced the number of decisions made blindly. Communication helped turn those reports into coordinated action. Riders carried orders between formations, while flags, horns, drums, and other signals could direct movement when troops were spread across a battlefield. The decimal organization created earlier by Temujin gave those signals a structure. Each commander knew which smaller units answered to him and which higher command he served. a message did not need to reach every rider separately. It moved through an established chain, allowing many men to change direction, withdraw, or concentrate without becoming an uncontrolled crowd. Deception was another element of this system. One of the best-known Mongol tactics was the feigned retreat, in which riders appeared to flee and encouraged an enemy to pursue. If the pursuers broke formation, moved too far from support, or exhausted their horses, Mongol units could turn, surround them, or lead them toward fresh forces waiting beyond view. The method was not unique to the Mongols, and it did not succeed automatically. A false retreat had to look convincing without becoming a real collapse. Riders needed discipline to preserve spacing, respond to signals, and reverse direction at the chosen moment. An opponent who refused pursuit could deny the trap, while rough terrain or poor communication could make the maneuver dangerous for those attempting it. Its effectiveness came from organization rather than theatrical cleverness alone. The Mongols also used movement to create uncertainty about their numbers and intentions. Units might separate along different routes, appear before several places, and then gather where resistance was weakest. Campfires, dust, captured information, and deliberate displays could encourage an enemy to imagine a force larger or closer than it was. Fear sometimes spread ahead of the army, especially after reports of destruction travelled between cities. That reputation could produce surrender, but it could also harden resistance among people who believed they had no safe alternative. Psychological pressure was therefore one instrument among many, not a magical weapon that ended every campaign. Mounted archers could approach, release arrows, and move away while preserving distance, testing reactions before heavier contact. Repeated pressure might expose a weak flank or tempt defenders to advance. Once an opening appeared, fresh units could concentrate quickly. Such sequences required patience, because the purpose of an early attack was sometimes to gather knowledge rather than secure victory. The roots of these methods reach back to the human beginning of collective hunting and defense, when survival depended on observing movement, sharing signals, and drawing animals or enemies away from safety. Genghis Khan enlarged those old cooperative skills across armies made from many peoples. Scouts provided sight, messengers provided memory, commanders provided sequence, and disciplined riders turned intention into motion. None of them alone explained conquest. Together, they allowed a force to arrive where opponents had not prepared, disappear before a counterattack, and return from another direction. The man who had once escaped by hiding and depending on another household's silence now commanded an organization that treated information itself as a form of protection. His victories were not produced by speed alone, but by deciding where speed should carry thousands of people before the enemy understood what that movement meant. Mounted speed gave the Mongols an advantage in open country, but it could not by itself bring down walls, cross-defended rivers, or govern cities filled with people who lived by different skills. Each new campaign exposed a gap between what the steppe had taught and what conquest now required. Genghis Khan's answer was not to pretend that his own people already knew everything. He drew engineers, artisans, scribes, guides, infantrymen, and surrendered soldiers into Mongol service, using knowledge that had belonged to the societies placed under pressure. Chinese and Khitan specialists helped construct and operate siege equipment during campaigns against fortified states. Uyghur and other literate servants carried orders and kept records. Local guides explained roads, water, gates, and the habits of defenders. Some of these people entered service voluntarily because Mongol rule offered protection, reward, or advancement. Others were compelled after defeat and had little control over where their abilities would be used. The growing military system was therefore both adaptable and coercive. When a city surrendered, skilled workers might be identified and separated from the wider population. Craftsmen could be moved across long distances to make weapons, repair equipment, produce textiles, or support the ruling household. Engineers who understood stonework, earthworks, projectiles, and defensive structures could be assigned to later campaigns. The knowledge taken from one frontier then travelled toward another. A method encountered in northern China might become useful farther west, while specialists from Central Asia could later serve in conflicts far from their homes. This movement of skill did not occur without loss. Families were divided, communities lost trained workers, and individuals became instruments of a conquering power. The empire gained capacity because conquered societies paid with people as well as goods. Siege warfare made this dependence especially clear. A mounted archer could approach a wall, but could not make the wall disappear. Attackers needed machines, timber, rope, labour, calculations and patience. They might isolate a city, cut communications, divert water, dig beneath defences, bombard gates, or wait for hunger and fear to weaken resistance. No single technique worked everywhere. Fortifications differed, landscapes changed, and defenders adapted. Mongol armies sometimes failed, withdrew, or spent long periods before strong places. Their reputation for rapid victory should not hide the slow work performed by thousands of people who were not mounted warriors. Genghis Khan's achievement lay partly in making these different forms of labour serve one command. He did not replace cavalry with siege forces. He combined them. Riders could surround a region, prevent relief armies from approaching, capture nearby settlements, and carry information between distant camps. Engineers and infantry could then address obstacles that horses could not overcome. After a breach or surrender, administrators and translators helped convert military access into tribute, supply, or continued control. The earliest human communities survived by sharing specialized knowledge. One person remembered water, another shaped stone, another understood animals, and another knew the paths between groups. Mongol expansion enlarged this old pattern while removing much of its freedom. Cooperation crossed languages and cultures, but it often did so under threat. The army became powerful because it was not culturally sealed. It could borrow, preserve, relocate, and reuse whatever conquest made available. This flexibility helps explain how a society born in mobile camps challenged states built around walls and permanent institutions. Genghis Khan's forces did not succeed because settled knowledge was inferior. They succeeded in part because they captured that knowledge and placed it beside the movement, discipline, and command already developed on the steppe. Their hands widened the empire, even when their consent remained uncertain. The outcast who once survived through help from outsiders now built an empire that depended on outsiders at every stage. His conquests grew whenever he recognized a skill his own followers lacked, but every borrowed skill also carried the quieter history of a person removed from one world and made to build power for another. By the late 1210s, Genghis Khan's power had reached the frontiers of the Khwarazmian Empire, a vast state stretching across much of Central Asia and Iran. Its ruler, Sultan Muhammad, commanded wealthy cities, irrigated farmland, caravan routes, and armies drawn from several regions. The Mongols had already expanded westward through lands once controlled by the Kara Khitai, bringing them closer to the commercial world of Transoxiana. Contact did not begin with an invasion. It began through merchants, messages, and an attempt to define how two rising powers would deal with one another. Trade offered benefits to both sides. The Mongol court wanted textiles, metalwork, luxury goods, and access to the markets of the Islamic world. Khwarazmian merchants had long moved between settled cities and the peoples of the steppe, carrying goods as well as news. Genghis Khan appears to have encouraged this exchange, and Muslim merchants served within networks connected to his court. Yet commerce could not be separated from politics. A caravan associated with a powerful ruler might also carry information, and border officials had reason to suspect that merchants could observe roads, defences, and local conditions. Suspicion, however, was not proof. In 1218, a large caravan travelling from Mongol territory reached Otrar, a frontier city governed by Inalchuk, also known as Genghis Khan. Medieval accounts differ over the exact number and status of the travellers, so the caravan should not be described with false precision. It was substantial, carried valuable goods, and had links to the Mongol ruling circle. The governor accused its members of espionage, arrested them, confiscated their property, and ordered their deaths. One survivor is said to have escaped and carried news back east, although the details come from later narratives. The event transformed a commercial approach into a crisis between rulers. From the earliest human exchanges, trade depended on a fragile agreement that travellers could cross another community's territory without being treated automatically as enemies. When that agreement failed at Otrar, the loss was not only material, it damaged rules that allowed distant societies to meet without violence. Genghis Khan did not immediately send his main army. He dispatched envoys to Sultan Muhammad, demanding an explanation, the punishment or surrender of the governor, and redress for the seized caravan. This response reflected more than anger over lost wealth. Envoys represented the ruler who sent them, and harming them attacked the possibility of negotiation itself. Accounts agree that the Khwarazmian response deepened the rupture, although they vary in detail. One envoy was killed, while others were reportedly humiliated and returned. The exact words attributed to both courts cannot be recovered, and later, historians often shape the episode into a moral story about arrogance followed by punishment. The safer conclusion is that the treatment of merchants and envoys gave Genghis Khan a powerful justification for war, while convincing him that ordinary diplomatic pressure had failed. This did not mean the conflict had only one cause. The frontier was already tense. Both empires were expanding, and control of Central Asian routes carried strategic and economic value. Sultan Muhammad may also have feared that accepting Mongol demands would expose weakness before his own commanders and subjects. Decisions made at Otrar were therefore tied to a larger structure of ambition, insecurity, and divided authority. Still, the crisis mattered because it turned distance into personal obligation. The boy once abandoned when others refused to defend his household now ruled a system in which merchants and envoys travelled under his protection. Their deaths challenged the promise holding that system together. If he ignored them, followers might question whether service to him truly guaranteed protection. The road toward Khwarazm began with that problem. Before armies crossed rivers or cities saw Mongol banners, a commercial mission had failed, diplomacy had been violated, and Genghis Khan now had to decide how far his authority would travel in defense of people who carried his name. In 1219, Genghis Khan moved against the Khwarazmian Empire with a force shaped by years of steppe warfare, but now supported by engineers, scribes, guides, and soldiers drawn from many conquered peoples. The empire before him was broad and wealthy, yet its strength was unevenly distributed. Sultan Muhammad commanded numerous troops, fortified cities, and rich agricultural regions, but he did not concentrate his forces into one army capable of meeting the Mongols in open battle. Instead, substantial garrisons were placed inside separate cities. This decision may have reflected distrust among commanders, uncertainty about Mongol numbers, and confidence in walls that had resisted earlier enemies. Whatever the reasoning, it allowed Genghis Khan to attack political centres one after another while preventing them from supporting each other effectively. The Mongols did not advance in one visible mass. Their forces divided along several routes, creating uncertainty about where the main attack would fall. One army approached Otrar, where the earlier caravan had been destroyed. Other columns moved toward the heart of Transoxiana, while mounted detachments watched roads and pursued messengers. Genghis Khan himself crossed difficult country to appear near Bukhara from a direction that defenders had not expected. The movement required knowledge of water, pasture, and desert routes, probably assisted by local information and experienced guides. It was not proof that Mongol horses could survive without supplies. It showed how careful planning could turn an environment commonly treated as a barrier into a path around prepared defences. Bukhara fell after a brief resistance outside its inner citadel, though the exact sequence and speeches preserved by later writers cannot be treated as direct records. Samarkand, a larger and more strongly defended city, soon faced Mongol forces that included captives and auxiliaries gathered during the advance. Some defenders resisted, some surrendered, and some units attempted to escape. The city eventually fell, leaving the Khwarazmian government without one of its central bases. Behind these victories stood a simple strategic effect. Orders moved between columns through messengers, while captured roads and river crossings narrowed the choices available to defenders. This coordination did not prevent delay, confusion, or loss, but it allowed Mongol forces to support a common design, even when they were not visible to one another. Each isolated garrison had to make decisions with limited information, while Mongol commanders shared reports across a coordinated network. A city could hear that another had fallen but could not know which roads remained safe or whether relief was coming. Fear widened the physical distance between places that had once belonged to the same state. The beginning of human settlement had made cities powerful by concentrating food, labour, craft, and authority behind walls. Genghis Khan now turned that concentration into a weakness by isolating each centre from the wider system that sustained it. The walls protected those inside for a time, but they also fixed defenders in place while the attackers chose where to gather. Sultan Muhammad withdrew westward rather than risk a decisive confrontation. Mongol commanders pursued him across Central Asia and into Iran, forcing him to move repeatedly until he died on an island in the Caspian Sea in late 1220. His flight did not mean that all resistance ended. Cities, regional commanders, and his son Jalal al-Din continued to fight, sometimes with considerable success. Yet the central authority connecting the empire had fractured. The conquest of Khwarazm was therefore not produced by one battle or one superior weapon. It came from separating communication, leadership, and defense faster than the opposing state could restore them. The outcast, who had once survived because a small household concealed him, now commanded forces able to make an entire imperial government lose sight of its own territory. His army crossed deserts, surrounded cities, and pursued a ruler across regions, but its deepest advantage was organizational. It could remain one political will, while compelling each enemy center to face the invasion almost alone. The destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire was not only a demonstration of military coordination, it was a human catastrophe spread across cities, farms, roads, and families. When Mongol armies captured a place that had resisted, punishment could be severe. Defenders were killed, civilians were separated, skilled workers were selected for service, and others were driven from homes they had expected to keep for generations. Medieval chronicles often report enormous numbers of deaths, but those figures cannot always be confirmed and may reflect literary convention, incomplete information, or attempts to express horror through scale. The suffering itself does not depend on accepting every number. Cities such as Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, and others experienced violence, displacement, loss of property, and the breakdown of ordinary life. The effects varied from place to place. Some settlements surrendered and retained more of their population. Others resisted, revolted after submission, or became symbols of defiance, and the response could be devastating. Mongol policy was not identical in every campaign, yet a pattern appeared. Surrender before prolonged resistance might preserve more lives, while continued opposition could bring collective punishment. This was intended to discourage later cities from fighting, turning fear into a tool that travelled ahead of the army, yet fear did not remove the need for battle. It sometimes encouraged surrender, but it could also convince defenders that no safe outcome remained. The destruction extended beyond walls. Irrigation channels could be damaged, fields abandoned, animals taken, and local networks of trade interrupted. When farmers fled or were killed, food production declined. When craftsmen were removed, communities lost knowledge as well as labour. When merchants avoided unsafe roads, towns that depended on exchange became poorer. Even places not directly attacked could receive refugees, lose tax income, or face shortages. Conquest therefore moved through bodies long after soldiers departed. Hunger, exposure, disease, and the loss of family support could continue the damage without appearing in a battle account. At the beginning of human settlement, cities allowed knowledge and labour to accumulate across generations. A canal built by one group could feed children born decades later. A workshop could train apprentices who preserved techniques after the master died. When warfare broke those chains, the loss was not limited to buildings. It interrupted memory carried through daily practice. Genghis Khan's forces also absorbed what they destroyed. Engineers, scribes, artisans, and soldiers were transported into Mongol service, where their abilities strengthened later campaigns. From the viewpoint of the expanding empire, this was practical adaptation. From the viewpoint of the separated household, it could mean permanent removal from language, relatives, and place. The same process that made Mongol power more flexible made conquered populations more fragmented. It is important not to reduce Genghis Khan to a figure of mindless destruction. His campaigns followed political aims, relied on negotiation, and sometimes preserved communities that submitted. Nor should efficiency be allowed to hide the moral weight of the methods used. The organization that protected loyal followers also made large-scale punishment possible. Orders could move quickly, cities could be isolated, populations could be classified, and terror could be applied deliberately to reduce future resistance. The outcast who had learned that abandonment could destroy a family now commanded a system capable of abandoning entire communities to ruin. His rise answered the problem of how scattered people could be united under one command, but Khwarazm revealed the other side of that achievement. A disciplined structure can create security for those inside it, while producing immense insecurity for those placed outside. The empire grew because thousands obeyed, adapted, and shared information. The same obedience carried violence farther than personal anger ever could. No map of territorial expansion can fully represent those quieter movements of grief, dependence, and broken continuity. Conquest expanded Genghis Khan's authority, but every road opened for his armies also became a road along which captives, refugees, and memories of loss were forced to travel. By the final years of Genghis Khan's life, the empire under his command stretched across a vast belt of Eurasia, but it had not yet reached the greatest size later associated with the Mongol name. His armies had united the Mongolian steppe, forced Western Xia into submission, taken much of northern China from the Jin, and shattered the political centre of the Khwarazmian Empire across Central Asia and areas of Iran. Mongol commanders had also ridden farther west in pursuit of enemies and in search of information, reaching the Caucasus and defeating forces beyond the Caspian region before returning east. These movements made the empire appear almost without limit to people who encountered news of one campaign after another. Yet movement through a territory was not the same as permanent rule, and victory over an army did not always mean that every town, village, or road had entered stable Mongol administration. The distinction matters because later generations often placed all Mongol expansion inside the lifetime of one man. Genghis Khan did not conquer all of China. The Jin dynasty continued to hold substantial lands after his death, and the southern Song remained independent. He did not lead the later invasions of Russia or Eastern Europe, and he never ruled the cities that his grandsons would later attack in the Middle East. Much of the empire remembered today was created by successors who inherited the military organization, political authority, and family claims that he had established. Their campaigns extended Mongol power into regions he had never seen. Genghis Khan's own achievement was therefore both smaller than the legend and larger than an ordinary map can easily explain. He created the structure that made later expansion possible. Commands could pass through organized units, conquered specialists could be moved where their skills were needed, and members of his family received responsibilities that connected distant fronts to one ruling house. The empire was not a single uniform administration. Different regions submitted in different ways, and control could remain shallow where armies had passed quickly. Tribute, military obedience, appointed governors, local rulers, and direct occupation existed beside one another. The beginning of Temujin's life helps make sense of this uneven world. He had first learned power through a fragile household whose protection disappeared when its relationships failed. As ruler, he built wider circles of obligation, but every new circle depended on people continuing to carry orders, deliver resources, and recognize his authority after the army moved away. Distance could weaken loyalty just as surely as the death of a leader had once weakened his family. In 1226, Genghis Khan returned to war against Western Xia after relations had broken down and the Tangut state had not supported earlier Mongol demands. He died in 1227 while that campaign was still unfolding. The precise cause of death remains uncertain, and later traditions offer stories that cannot be confirmed. At the moment of his death, the empire was immense, but it was still unfinished. Resistance continued in northern China, Central Asia remained unsettled, and the future depended on whether his sons and commanders could preserve unity without his physical presence. The phrase known world therefore requires care. To many communities across Eurasia, Mongol power had entered the horizon with extraordinary speed, linking regions that had rarely faced one command. But vast regions of Asia, Europe, Africa, and the rest of the earth remained beyond Genghis Khan's rule. His significance did not come from literally possessing everything people knew. It came from changing the scale at which a steppe ruler could organize movement, loyalty, information, and conquest. That possibility, rather than a completed conquest of the world, became the inheritance his descendants carried into the decades that followed his death. The outcast had not taken the whole world. He had created a political machine capable of convincing those who followed him that the next horizon could also be reached. The empire Genghis Khan left behind was immense, but much of the world known to people of the 13th century remained beyond his rule. Western Europe had heard of distant steppe peoples and would later encounter Mongol armies more directly, yet Genghis Khan himself never invaded France, England, the Iberian Peninsula, or the Italian states. The Rus principalities and Eastern European kingdoms would face major Mongol campaigns only after his death, under commanders serving his descendants. India also lay mostly outside his authority. Mongol forces reached regions near the Indus while pursuing Jalal al-Din, but Genghis Khan did not establish lasting rule across the Indian subcontinent. The great states and societies of southern India remained far beyond his campaigns. Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea as a fully conquered territory, and the islands of the Pacific were not part of the empire he personally created. Much of the Middle East also remained unconquered during his lifetime, including Baghdad, which fell to a later Mongol army in 1258. Africa was never ruled by him, and the civilizations of the Americas were entirely outside the Eurasian networks through which his name travelled. Later generations would carry Mongol armies farther, but their victories belonged to another stage of the story. Batu's campaigns in Europe, Hulagu's advance into the Middle East, Kublai's conquest of the southern Song, and the failed invasions of Japan were not achievements Genghis Khan witnessed. They were extensions of a structure he founded, shaped by descendants facing landscapes, enemies, and limits of their own. These limits do not make his achievements small, they place them inside the real geography of his age. The phrase "known world" often reflects the viewpoint of those who experience political change across Eurasia, rather than a literal claim that every recognized land had been conquered. For merchants moving between Central Asia and northern China, for rulers hearing of fallen cities, and for communities watching refugees arrive from distant wars, Mongol power could seem to expand across nearly every meaningful horizon. News did not travel evenly, and maps were not shared in one universal form. People understood distance through roads, rivers, trade routes, stories, diplomatic reports, and the memories of travelers. When several major regions connected by those routes suddenly faced armies answering to one ruling family, the change could feel larger than any measured border. Genghis Khan's reputation therefore grew in two spaces at once. One was the physical territory where his commands could be enforced. The other was the mental territory created by rumor, fear, admiration, and uncertainty. A city that had never seen a Mongol rider might still change its diplomacy after hearing what had happened elsewhere. A ruler might strengthen defenses, seek allies, or send envoys because the possibility of future attack had entered political thought. In this way, influence moved farther than administration. The beginning of Temujin's life had been defined by a narrow circle of survival, limited to the people willing to protect one abandoned household. By the end of his life, decisions made around his court affected societies he would never visit. Yet even this wide influence had boundaries. Oceans, deserts, mountains, distance, climate, and powerful states limited what mounted armies could reach and hold. Supply problems grew as campaigns moved away from familiar pasture. Local resistance could continue after major victories. Successors had to negotiate, punish, appoint officials, and adapt institutions to regions with different languages and economies. The world was too large and too varied to become the possession of one man. Genghis Khan conquered a vast portion of Eurasia, but the greater truth lies not in pretending that he ruled everything. It lies in recognizing how far a political order born among scattered camps could extend before geography, administration, and time began to resist it. His empire reached beyond what his childhood world might have imagined, yet the horizon always remained wider than the power moving toward it. The territory ruled by Genghis Khan was vast, but the fear and expectation created by his victories travelled even farther. A map can show borders, rivers, cities, and routes. Yet it cannot fully show how rapidly political imagination changes when powerful states begin to fall. News of Mongol campaigns moved through merchants, refugees, envoys, soldiers, and religious communities. Reports were repeated in markets, courts, caravan stations, monasteries, and camps. Details changed as they travelled, but the central message remained clear. Armies from the steppe had crossed distances that many rulers believed would protect them, and governments that had appeared durable could be broken within a few seasons. This made Mongol power seem present even where no Mongol commander had yet arrived. A distant city might strengthen its walls, seek new allies, or send gifts simply because another city had been destroyed hundreds of miles away. The psychological frontier of the empire therefore moved ahead of its administrative frontier. Fear enlarged the territory in the human mind before officials, tribute collectors, or permanent garrisons could reach it. Genghis Khan's reputation also grew because his campaigns joined regions that had usually understood danger through separate local struggles. Northern China, Central Asia, the Iranian world, the Caucasus, and the steppe had their own rivalries, but Mongol expansion made them appear connected by one advancing force. For ordinary people, this connection was felt through higher taxes, military preparations, disrupted trade, refugee movement, and stories carried by exhausted travelers at night. A defeat in one region became evidence for rulers elsewhere. Each report seemed to confirm that the same organization could cross deserts, surround cities, defeat field armies, and continue moving without losing coherence. This impression was strengthened by the way Mongol commanders used information. They questioned captives, employed guides, protected useful merchants, and carried reports back through disciplined chains of communication. Opponents often knew less about the Mongols than the Mongols knew about them. Uncertainty then filled the missing space. Rumor could multiply army sizes, simplify complex battles, and turn tactical success into an image of invincibility. The Mongols were not invincible. They suffered losses, met resistance, failed before some fortifications, and depended on local resources and specialists. Yet a reputation does not require perfect truth to affect behavior. It requires enough truth to make the possibility believable. Genghis Khan had already destroyed or subordinated major centers of power, so even exaggerated stories rested on events that rulers could not ignore. The origin of this influence still reached back to the narrow world of Temujin's childhood. His family had once been politically invisible because no wider community believed that protecting them mattered. Late in his life, communities he had never visited already changed their decisions profoundly because they believed his attention might one day reach them. The movement from exclusion to influence was therefore greater than the movement of armies alone. He had built a system capable of making distant people anticipate his will. That system also allowed later generations to place their own victories beneath his name. When his sons and grandsons expanded into Russia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and southern China, many observers understood those campaigns as the continuation of a force created by Genghis Khan. His personal biography merged with the history of the dynasty. Lands he never ruled entered the legend surrounding what he had conquered, because his organization, family, and title remained at the center of expansion. The phrase known world grew from this mixture of geography, memory, and inheritance. Genghis Khan did not possess every land his contemporaries knew, but he changed the expectations of societies across much of Eurasia. His victories felt larger than the map because they altered what rulers believed was possible, what cities believed could protect them, and how far people imagined authority born on the steppe could travel. The empire occupied territory, but its reputation occupied the uncertain space beyond every frontier. In 1227, while the campaign against Western Xia was still unfolding, Genghis Khan died. The event ended the life of the man who had transformed a small and vulnerable following into the center of a vast Eurasian empire. Yet the circumstances remain uncertain. Later sources offered several explanations, including illness, injury from a fall, wounds received during conflict, and stories shaped by legend. None can be accepted with complete confidence. The surviving evidence is too late, too varied, and too closely tied to political memory to permit a single final answer. What is more secure is that his death occurred during the last campaign of his life, while Mongol forces were pressing the Tangut state toward destruction. His commanders and family had to manage the news carefully because the army was still operating in enemy territory, and because the unity of the empire depended heavily on the authority attached to his person. The body of Genghis Khan was reportedly carried back toward Mongolia, but the exact route and place of burial are unknown. Traditions describe a secret funeral and efforts to conceal the grave, yet many dramatic details appeared in later retellings and cannot be verified. Archaeology has not identified a burial site accepted by scholars as his tomb. The uncertainty has encouraged centuries of speculation, but the absence of evidence should not be filled with invented certainty. It is possible that the grave lies somewhere within the broader homeland associated with his lineage, perhaps near the sacred Burkhan Khaldun region, though even this remains a cautious historical possibility rather than a confirmed location. The secrecy itself may reflect steppe customs surrounding elite burial, the desire to protect the resting place from disturbance, or later efforts to enlarge the mystery around the founder of the dynasty. Without stronger evidence, these possibilities must remain separate from fact. His death created a problem that had followed him since childhood. What happens when a political order built around one living person must continue after that person is gone? When Yasuge died, followers abandoned Holun and her children because the relationships holding the household together were too fragile to survive the loss of their leader. Genghis Khan had spent much of his adult life constructing a system designed to resist that kind of collapse. Military units, appointed commanders, family responsibilities, scribes, messengers, and shared expectations of obedience gave the empire a structure extending beyond his body. Yet the risk remained. His sons had their own households, ambitions, and supporters. Conquered regions obeyed in different ways, and distant commanders possessed armies capable of acting independently. The succession therefore mattered not only to the ruling family, but to every community whose security now depended on whether Mongol unity continued. Genghis Khan had designated Ogedei as his preferred successor during his lifetime, apparently after discussion among his sons. This did not remove every tension, but it provided a recognized direction when the founder died. Tolui, the youngest son, held an important temporary role in the homeland before Ogedei was formally installed as Great Khan in 1229. The interval shows that succession required consultation, ceremony, and agreement among powerful members of the dynasty. Genghis Khan's death therefore did not halt Mongol expansion, nor did it immediately begin imperial disintegration at that moment. It was a test of whether the loyalty he had organized could survive its original center. The grave remained hidden, the cause remained uncertain, and the man himself could no longer command. What continued was the structure built from the lessons of abandonment, chosen service, reward, fear, and disciplined cooperation. Across the empire, families and commanders waited to see whether inherited obedience could become political continuity. His final silence did not answer what his empire would become without him. It only returned the question of his childhood on a far greater scale. Could a circle of protection remain whole after the person at its center disappeared? Genghis Khan's death did not end the movement he had set in motion. His sons inherited more than land, armies, and titles. They inherited a political system built from military units, appointed commanders, scribes, tribute networks, conquered specialists, and the expectation that members of the ruling family would share responsibility for expansion. Each major branch of the family received territories, followers, and rights within the larger empire, but these divisions were not meant to create fully independent states at once. Authority still centered on the office of the Great Khan, and important decisions required agreement among powerful relatives and commanders. In 1229, Ogedei was formally chosen as Great Khan, following the preference Genghis Khan had expressed before his death. His selection helped preserve continuity, but it did not erase rivalry among the brothers or uncertainty about how power should pass to the next generation. Under Ogedei, the empire continued to grow. Ogedei also strengthened the machinery of rule. His government developed the relay network, supported an imperial center at Karakoram, and worked through officials who collected resources from farming regions and cities. These measures did not create uniform government everywhere, but they helped armies receive orders and supplies. Expansion increasingly depended on administration, because victories could be lost if conquered populations were taxed without order, abandoned to conflict, or disconnected from the court. Mongol armies completed the destruction of the Jin dynasty, advanced into the lands of the Rus, entered Eastern Europe, and strengthened control across Central Asia. These campaigns were not simply repetitions of Genghis Khan's victories. They required new commanders, new alliances, and new adaptations to unfamiliar regions. Yet the structure he created made them possible. Units could be summoned across long distances, conquered peoples, supplied labor and knowledge, and members of the imperial family commanded separate fronts while still claiming to serve one ruling house. The empire survived because obedience had been distributed through institutions rather than left inside the memory of one man. At the same time, the family arrangement contained a quiet weakness. Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons belonged to one dynasty, but each also possessed his own followers, territories, and ambitions. Success in distant war could increase the independence of a branch of the family. A commander who controlled armies and tribute far from Mongolia could begin to see his interests differently from relatives ruling elsewhere. The same system that allowed the empire to expand in several directions also created several centers of power. Human families have always carried cooperation and competition together, especially when inheritance must be divided. Within the Mongol dynasty, the stakes were unusually large because disagreements among relatives could affect millions of people across widely separated lands. Selection of a new great Khan required meetings, travel, negotiation, and political support. Delays could interrupt campaigns, while rival candidates could draw different branches into conflict. These tensions did not destroy the empire immediately, but they grew with every generation. The descendants of Genghis Khan shared a sacred family authority, yet they did not always agree on who should control it or how conquered wealth should be divided. What they inherited was therefore both durable and unstable. It was durable because the army, administration, and ruling traditions could continue after the founder's death. It was unstable because those tools were now controlled by several powerful heirs whose cooperation could never be guaranteed forever. The outcast had solved the problem that once destroyed his childhood household by building bonds stronger than one lifetime. But he had not solved the deeper question of succession. No system can prevent every future leader from choosing ambition over unity. Genghis Khan left his descendants a road broad enough to carry armies across continents, yet every branch of the family could eventually choose a different direction. His empire continued because the circle held, but the seeds of division were already present inside the very family meant to preserve it. The empire created by Genghis Khan cannot be understood through admiration alone or through condemnation alone. Its rise brought cities to ruin, families into captivity, fields out of cultivation, and populations into flight. The organization that gave security to those inside Mongol command made destruction more efficient for those who resisted it. Orders traveled farther, armies coordinated across distance, and punishment could be applied on a scale no isolated raiding group could have achieved. These consequences belong permanently to his conquests. Yet, the empire also connected regions that had often communicated through narrower routes. Under Genghis Khan's successors, merchants, envoys, artisans, scholars, religious figures, and technologies moved across Eurasia with new intensity. Roads were protected, diplomatic contacts widened, and knowledge crossed political and cultural boundaries. These exchanges did not cancel the violence that made the empire possible. A road may carry a physician, a trader, or a book, while the same road remembers captives and armies. Historical truth lies in holding both movements together without using one to erase the other. Genghis Khan's life also resists a simple lesson about individual greatness. Temujin began as a boy whose family had lost communal protection. He survived through Holand's labour, the support of siblings and companions, people who sheltered him, and alliances with leaders who possessed resources he lacked. His later victories depended on riders, herders, scouts, scribes, engineers, craftsmen, translators, administrators, wives, sons, defeated peoples, and countless unnamed workers. The man at the centre mattered, but no empire is built by one body. His unusual ability was to organize separate lives around a shared command, remember service, reward usefulness, break rival loyalties, and adapt knowledge from unfamiliar societies. The same ability could protect followers and expose outsiders to devastating harm. This is the educational value of returning to his story without legend. Power is not only the force of a ruler's personality, it is the structure that allows thousands of decisions to move in one direction. It grows when people carry messages, provide food, obey orders, accept categories, and believe that their future depends on a larger system. That understanding makes history more useful because it shifts attention away from the myth of the solitary conqueror. It asks us to examine the relationships that make command possible and the responsibility distributed through them. Genghis Khan transformed exclusion into authority, but the qualities that enabled his survival did not remain innocent when enlarged. Loyalty became discipline, protection became expansion, adaptation became the forced movement of human skill. Memory of abandonment became a political order in which leaving could be dangerous. None of these changes were automatic, and none made conquest inevitable. They were choices made within a harsh environment, then repeated until they became institutions capable of surviving their founder. His descendants inherited those institutions, widened the empire, and governed regions whose languages, religions, economies, and landscapes differed from the Mongolian steppe. Over time, the imperial family divided into khanates, each adapting to local conditions and pursuing its own interests. The political unity Genghis Khan created did not last forever, but the movement of people, knowledge, fear, and memory continued after borders changed. His story, therefore, returns to the paradox at its beginning. A child learned that a family without allies could become almost invisible, then built a system that made his name visible across continents. He showed how human cooperation can overcome distance and inherited division, while also showing how organized cooperation can magnify violence beyond personal anger. The most honest legacy is not that suffering was justified by connection, or that connection was meaningless because suffering occurred. It is that human organization carries the values of those who direct it, and the choices of those who sustain it. When an outcast conquers the world by teaching strangers to share one future, who truly creates the empire, the ruler who gives the command, or the people who decide to carry it?